The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday that smelled of wet leaves and the last barbecue of the year. But the line that turned my blood to ice wasn't the court date or the case number. It was the single sentence halfway down the page. CO counsel, Mara Whitlock and Elias Vargo. My wife was listed as the representing attorney for the man she'd sworn was nothing more than a client, a ghost. A mistake she'd already buried under late-night apologies and new pillowcases. I stood on the porch with the envelope trembling like a trapped moth in my hand, hearing the garage door open behind me and her voice calling. "Babe, did the mail come?" Casual, bright, the same tone she'd used the morning I proposed. I swallowed the sour rush of adrenaline and said, "Yeah, mostly junk," folding the subpoena so the fatal line faced inward, like a blade I couldn't afford to show until I knew how sharp it really was. She kissed my cheek on her way to the car, briefcase bumping my hip, perfume citrus and ambition. I watched her back out, brake lights flaring, and felt the first crack spider across the windshield of whatever life we'd built together. Inside, I spread the pages on the kitchen island like tarot cards predicting a future I didn't want to believe in. The case was civil, Elias Vargo versus Whitlock and Associates, my wife's own firm, my wife's own name, suing her for malpractice and fraud, demanding 7 figures in damages. The complaint alleged she'd conspired with an opposing party to falsify evidence, and the opposing party was listed as co-counsel. Her. I read the sentence 3 times, the words rearranging themselves into the same damning picture. The man I'd caught her texting at 2 a.m. was now her legal partner in destroying the company our joint bank account depended on. I met Mara 12 years earlier in the campus library, her highlighters lined up like soldiers, mine dried out and chewed. She'd whispered, "You look like someone who'd share his coffee." And I'd given her the whole cup, keeping the empty lid as a souvenir for months. We married 3 years after that, merged futures the way kids braid grass. Tight, hopeful, certain the knot would hold forever. She went corporate. I opened a small woodworking studio, building custom tables that grew heavy with other families' memories. We talked about kids someday, about a bigger house when the timing was right, about trust being the one thing we'd never outsource. The first time I noticed the slippage was 6 months ago, a Wednesday that ended in silence. She'd come home late, heels in hand, mascara freckling her lids, and when I hugged her she smelled of cedar and unfamiliar cologne. She said discovery was brutal. Opposing counsel had sprayed documents like confetti. She needed a shower. I believed her because belief was easier than interrogating the hickey-shaped bruise on the slope of her collarbone. She insisted was a briefcase bump. A week later I found the second phone. Sleek, black, fingerprint sealed. Tucked under a stack of pleadings she brought home. It buzzed while she showered, screen lighting with a single initial, E. I stared until the screen dimmed, then put it back, heart hammering loud enough I was sure the water would stop and she'd call through the steam. "Did you hear something?" She didn't, and I told myself everyone keeps a work phone. Even when the texts that eventually bled through the lock screen read like poetry written in a language I'd stopped speaking with her. "Miss your mouth, stay later. Promise it's almost over." I never asked, because asking gives shape to the thing you're afraid of, and I was busy sanding oak for a farmhouse table that would outlast whatever temporary glitch we'd survive. Instead, I counted the signs like carpenter's pencils behind my ear. The sudden change of passwords, the way she flinched when I came up behind her at the stove, the late nights that added up to more hours than there are in a day. I told myself marriages have seasons, some cold, some raw, all survivable if you keep sanding. But the subpoena wasn't a splinter. It was a split down the grain, and the blade was in her handwriting. Every legal caption proofread by her, every signature the same flourish that once signed my birthday cards, "Love you bigger." I drove to the studio, locked the door, spread the pleadings on my workbench beside a half-built crib I'd started the month she mentioned maybe trying for kids. The contrast was obscene. Fresh maple meant for new beginnings, legal paper announcing the end of everything. I read the allegations line by line, learning a script she hadn't shared. That she and Elias had doctored emails, backdated memos, leaked privileged documents to the opposing side in a commercial eviction case now worth millions in sanctions. The plaintiff was her own firm, our income, our mortgage, the retirement account we'd nicknamed the Sailboat Fund. And the defense was her and the man whose texts I'd memorized in spite of myself. She wasn't just cheating. She was burning the house down and charging us rent on the ashes. My first instinct was to call her, scream, demand the explanation that would make this an error, a typo, a cosmic joke. Instead, I drove to the courthouse, paid $10 for the entire file, sat in my truck with the engine off, and read the exhibits. Screenshots of her and Elias on video calls, timestamps overlapping the nights she'd told me she was in depositions. Signatures on settlement agreements that bore her firm's letterhead but routed settlement money to an offshore account linked to Elias's LLC. Every page was a paper cut across the calluses I'd built trying to hold us together, that I went home at dusk. Found her at the stove humming along to the playlist we used during renovations. The one that ends with the song we played the night we sealed the hardwood together on our knees, varnish in our hair, drunk on progress. She didn't hear me, so I watched her stir, the sway of her hips measuring time like a metronome, and I wondered if she choreographed the same sway in his office, on his desk, against the window overlooking the avenue where I'd once carried her over a puddle so her new heels wouldn't soak that I cleared my throat. She spun, startled, then smiled. Wide, practiced, the same smile that had charred juries for 12 years. "Hey, stranger," she said. "You're late. Pasta's almost ready." I held up the subpoena, let the pages dangle like a verdict. Her face went through seasons in a second. Summer confidence, autumn doubt, winter dread. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, reached for the papers, and I let her take them, watching the way her lips moved as she read, silently rehearsing objections that wouldn't work on me. "Before you say anything," she started, voice low, courtroom steady, "this is not what it looks like." I laughed, a sound like splitting wood, and said, "That's what guilty clients say on cross, Mara. You taught me that." She tried to touch my arm. I stepped back, feeling the stove's heat against my thighs, remembering the crib upstairs, the sandpaper still in my pocket, that we stood in the kitchen we'd torn down to studs, the place where we'd danced to no music the night the inspector finally signed off on the wiring, and I asked the only question left. Was any of it real? She closed her eyes, shoulders sagging, and for a moment she looked like the girl in the library who needed coffee. But when she opened them, they were attorney eyes, calculating damages. "I messed up," she said, "but the firm left me no choice. They were going to push Elias out, ruin him, and I—" She stopped, hearing the pronoun that wasn't us that I left before the pasta boiled over, drove nowhere, ended up outside Aaron's apartment. She opened the door, took one look, pulled me in, poured whiskey, and let me talk until the words ran out and silence took the stand. She offered the couch, but I slept in my truck, windows fogged, dreaming of saws cutting through grain that sealed itself back overnight, a joint that refused divorce. The next weeks were discovery in the crudest sense. I hired my own attorney, an old college friend who owed me a dining table and a favor. Filed to intervene in the firm's case, demanding access to Mara's personal devices and bank records. The judge, a woman Mara once clerked for, granted my motion with a look that mixed pity and fury, the way you regard a stray dog still loyal to the owner who kicked it. We subpoenaed security footage from Mara's building, found video of her and Elias entering the document storage room at 1 a.m., leaving with boxes. I watched the footage in my lawyer's conference room. The screen blue and flickering, Mara in power suit and sneakers, Elias carrying the cart like they were looters who'd memorized the floor plan. When the camera caught her laughing up at him, the same lopsided grin she'd given me over morning coffee, I felt the final splinter give way. The joint was unsalvageable, would turn to dust. Depositions began. I sat across from her for 7 hours, a mahogany table between us polished to a mirror she couldn't look into. My attorney walked her through every invoice, every wire transfer, every midnight login. She invoked privilege at first, then immunity, then desperation, claiming Elias had manipulated her, that love made her stupid, that she'd planned to come clean. I listened without blinking, carving grooves into the table's edge with my thumbnail, feeling the shape of each lie settle like dovetails that would never quite close. Elias's deposition was worse. He wore the same cologne I'd smelled on her robe, smiled at me like we shared a secret, and insisted the firm's eviction case had targeted low-income tenants unfairly, that he and Mara were whistleblowers, not conspirators. He said we believed, we decided, we acted, until the words sounded like a lock clicking shut. When my attorney played the video of them hauling boxes, he shrugged. Love makes you protect what matters. I wanted to smash the camera, but the image was already in my blood. The firm's partners filed for criminal referral. The U.S. attorney took the case. Indictments dropped on a gray morning while I sanded the crib I couldn't finish. Sawdust snowing across the workshop floor like fallout. Mara called from the courthouse steps, voice echoing off marble, asking if I'd post bond. I said, I already paid it, 5 years. Every morning I woke up believing we were on the same side. She cried, sound swallowed by the receiver, and I hung up before the dial tone could testify. Trial date set for spring, the same week Mara and I would have celebrated our 13th anniversary. I spent the months building tables for other people's nurseries, each dovetail a small promise that something could still hold. I sold the house, the market hot, the memories hotter, and moved into the apartment above the studio, where floorboards creaked like jurors shifting in their seats. Aaron brought groceries, left casseroles, told me grief was just sanding against the grain. Painful, necessary, the only way to reveal the grain underneath. Courtroom 4 was wood-paneled, benches polished by decades of longing and loss. I sat behind the prosecution, close enough to see the tension in Mara's neck whenever Elias leaned over to whisper. They wore matching navy suits, partners to the end, and I wondered if they chose the color together, if they rehearsed sympathy in the mirror, if they understood that the jury would see symmetry and call it conspiracy. Testimony lasted 3 weeks. Emails were read aloud. Love letters disguised as strategy. Timestamps overlapping our anniversary dinner, my birthday, the night my father died, and she left the hospital early for emergency briefing. I listened, carved a tiny notch into the bench rail for every lie, until the wood looked like a prison tally. Closing arguments came. The prosecutor, a woman with Mara's haircut but none of her warmth, told the jury that betrayal dressed in professionalism was still betrayal, that the law was a joint venture requiring absolute faith, and that faith had been sold for profit and passion. She pointed at Mara and Elias, said, "They joined forces against the very people who trusted them, and justice demands the bond be severed with the same precision they used to forge it." The defense argued love, argued whistleblowing, argued that the firm's greed had made criminals of them all. But the evidence was a table built with hidden joints, every peg and screw exposed now, and when the foreman read guilty on all counts, the word landed like a gavel in my chest, final, hollow, oddly relieving. Sentencing fell on a humid afternoon. The judge, voice steady, gave them each 7 years to run consecutively, not concurrent, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction. Mara's eyes found mine as the bailiff moved forward, and for the first time since the library she looked small, highlight faded, briefcase gone. I didn't smile, didn't cry. I simply nodded, the way you acknowledge a verdict you knew was coming the moment you saw fingers intertwine over champagne. They led her away past the bench where I sat. She paused, whispered, "I'm sorry," so softly only I and the wood that held us both could hear. I said nothing, because forgiveness isn't a courtroom courtesy, it's a workshop built later, alone, with tools that remember every grain. Outside, reporters shouted questions about justice and love gone criminal. I walked through them, feeling the city's pulse steady against my wrist, and drove to the studio where the unfinished crib waited. I fed it through the saw one last time, dismantling every rail, sanding each piece until the edges rounded, soft as forgiveness might feel years from now. I built a bench instead, long, sturdy, meant for a porch I hadn't bought yet, and carved across the back the only verdict that mattered. Some joints hold, some don't. Truth is the grain that remains. I sat on the bench in the doorway, dusk settling like sawdust on skin, and felt the ache linger, clean and empty, the shape of a future I could finally build without looking over my shoulder at the ruins.